Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
A fabricated case against alleged members of an imaginary terrorist organization. A show trial followed by harsh prison sentences and persistent protests over allegations of torture and falsified evidence. In many ways, Jelisati, or the network case, has become emblematic of the repressive tactics Vladimir Putin's regime is prepared to use to intimidate civil society and civil society's ability to resist them. So what does this strange and disturbing criminal case and its aftermath tell us about Russia today? Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University.
Afternoon,
well,
guys.
Good afternoon, Don. I see you did not get a haircut this week.
No, neither
I did. I did,
okay.
yes. And also with us in the studio here is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Maria.
Welcome, thank you, and definitely getting a haircut tomorrow.
You're getting a haircut tomorrow.
Good.
All right. Well, that's. I'm glad everybody knows that, and I'm glad everybody knows I get a haircut every Friday. So, some quick background about this case. On February 10th, 7 activists aged between 23 and 30 were convicted of being part of a terrorist group and were given sentences of between 6 and 18 years. They were arrested back in October 2017 and accused of forming a terrorist group called Set, or Network, and plotting attacks in Russia during the presidential election and the World Cup soccer tournament in 2018. Critics claim the case is fabricated and that the alleged terrorist group doesn't even exist, and that the defendants were tortured during interrogations. Since the sentencing, and this is where it gets really interesting, a series of protests have ensued, including a bunch of open letters, including one from more than 100 animators, several hundred Russian artists, museum workers, and gallery curators, several dozen members of the Association of Independent Public Monitors, which is a group of lawyers, and as well as a group of scientists and scientific journalists. You get a broad swath of the society kind of protesting these sentences. On February 17th, this caught my eye. At least 13 independent bookstores in at least 9 cities shut their doors for a day in strike to protest the verdicts, and there's also been public protests in Moscow, Penza, and Irkutsk. Now, in an article in Novaya Vremya suggested that the case was designed to intimidate youth activists who have been growing increasingly restive. Maria, what are your thoughts on this? What do you make of this? I know you've been following this pretty closely, commenting on it on social media. Mm-hmm. What do you make of this?
Well, as a Russian citizen, I am definitely, as my society, at least some groups in my society, definitely quite empathetic with things that are going on there. And this is definitely a horrendous development, another step in an unfortunate evolution of the regime. Primarily, we're talking about sentences that are not even Stalinist by all means, because Stalin's sentences were 10 to 15 most of the time.
Or
subsequently, death. Or death. Yeah, that's a good point. But here we're getting up to 18. They are getting up to 18 years in jail. And also these poor kids were tortured during this process, during this trial, in an effort to get some of kind of evidence from them, of course, faked. So this is definitely something we haven't witnessed before. And those people who are aware, those who follow what's happening in Russia, definitely they are more and more reluctant to keep silent. We have spoken here that Russian society is modernizing, that it's not, stagnating, and these modernizing streams within the country are primarily manifested among the youth. Mm-hmm. And what we recently observed through these trials as this network or set trial, the new greatness, another youth group that's also under trial right now. The sentences in terms, but potential terms in jail are not as great, but still big. And also, of course, the Moscow trials. Right. All of those show that the regime regime is quite aware that there is increasing the social groups that are opposing to the way things are in Russia, and tries to repress the social groups in an effort to keep them silent.
But what's different about the Siet case and the Novovelikost case is that, well, at least in the case of Siet, this seems to have been fabricated out of whole cloth.
Yeah.
This group doesn't exist. I mean, these kids are all activists. From what I understand, they're anti-fascist activists. I don't know if they were formally members of Antifa or not, but they were anti-fascist activists. But there was no organization here. I understood they kind of like played war games in the woods and stuff, but there was certainly no plot to like blow things up in Russia during the World Cup or the presidential election. That to me seems like a qualitative leap for the regime.
Also, not a single person hurt as a result of their alleged activities. Nothing happened.
Well, because nothing happened. No group existed. I mean, it's kind
Except
of crazy.
in their war game.
That's not completely new, though. During the Moscow trials, we also saw cases which were completely fabricated from scratch. For example, one guy got arrested as alleged someone who kind of infuriated the crowds and sometimes who fueled the crowds. Yegor Zhukov, he's currently on Echo of Moscow. But as a result, it was turned out, and the evidence was the video on the which or photos on which he allegedly essentially managed the crowds.
Right.
Later, it was proven that it wasn't him.
Right.
On the photos was not his picture, and yet he still got sentenced, although luckily only a suspended sentence in the end. That case was one of the first developments in this unfortunate direction where everything is fabricated pretty much from scratch.
Right. But this to me just does seem like a qualitative leap. Don, what do you make
Well,
of
I
this?
agree with Maria, who's going to get her haircut tomorrow. There's a lot of really big issues here today, and I think first of all, Maria hit it on the head. This is a society that's changing, and second, this is a regime that is aware that society is changing and threatened by it. And I think it may well be, Brian, that this was an easy mark. You set an example this way. There's a lot of other issues here about law enforcement, but it may just be they felt they could set an example at a low cost to the regime, although maybe they miscalculated.
Yeah,
not for the first time.
I mean, because this is where I wanted to go. Was this random? Was this overzealous, FSB people in Pienza, or was this part of a Kremlin strategy? Marie, you seem to think of the Kremlin strategy.
I don't
and I tend to
think
agree with that.
there is much randomness to it. Of course, Siloviki all over the country are trying to show how eager they are to serve and get their medals or promotions. No questions about that, but they're incentivized by the signals that they receive from the top. In the case of this DLCT, the network trial, we know that, as a matter of fact, Putin is aware there's people who tried to reach out, and he let this go. So, there's rumors also that he essentially definitely was behind it. One difference, you may ask, why do we see, for example, that the Moscow trial cases were not as sentences were not as huge as in this case? My theory is that Moscow trials do take place in Moscow. Crowds here are much more civic. The threats
Media
of Protestant
coverage,
stabilization, media coverage. The Siet trial takes place in Penza. It's a provincial town, not as much attention. Moscovites, some of the activists, they go there.
They went there, and they were also themselves harassed and detained.
Absolutely, and that's important also to point out. But there's actually networks developing within Russia, not the ones that are networks on trial, but the real groups of activists that are active all over the country, and that's important. However, there's just not enough of protests in Penza in order to be able to create a large enough movement to scale it down. But maybe, and as you started this podcast with, maybe this, again, the wave of civic action and these collective petitions that are being signed right now by different social groups, maybe they will able to create another movement that will at least scale down this sentence.
Yeah, no, because this is the other thing I wanted to get to is like what struck me were the not just the scope of those protesting this. I mean, animators, museum gallery curators, lawyers, scientists, scientific journalists, bookstores. I mean, it's like it's people that usually don't get out and protest. Let's face it, like gallery curators.
Yeah.
Cultural elites. Cultural
Not really
elites, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed to be a lot of cultural figures. I mean, that does seem, with the exception of the lawyers and the scientists. So it is kind of cultural and scientific workers, if you will.
Especially in the country, I just wanted to point it out for our audience. In the country where the culture of science has been a mean of survival in the last century, this means a lot, that these people actually speak out.
Right.
Yes, right now they organize as a relatively small professional community, like those bookstores were quite few and not the largest ones. The largest
13 bookstores in 9 cities. That's
Still,
something.
they're not the largest ones, but that's something. And it's important that they're now able to speak out. For Russians, given the horrible history, it's an achievement. That's what I want to say. It's something
So
new.
it may have emboldened them, but on the other hand, I go back to my point. It's still they're relatively an easy mark. It's not like truck drivers who protest for more economic reasons, it seems. This is a political freedom of expression issue with people who might be able to push around. I don't think these people, admirable as they are, have a lot of public support. I want to make a couple other points about this whole issue. Reading it, Brian, I'm glad you highlighted it because it reminded me of comparison to two things. One is how they handled the demonstrations last summer, and two is Khodorkovsky. They're I think we recall, I think we may even have talked about it, that the Vlast was internally debating how to handle this kind of thing. And I don't think Putin and many people in Vlast want to have a massive crackdown, and maybe this is a way to send a message and intimidate people. I don't think it will work in the society that you often mention is changing. The second is the enforcement issue, which is that I would somewhat give an asterisk with what you both said. Remember in 2004, when Khodorkovsky was apprehended or arrested, it seemed to me at the time that there were a lot of local and intermediate siloviki who acted down the chain to pursue their financial or other interests, given what they saw as a green light from the top. And we always have the question about Putin. Did the Tsar know or did he not know?
Khodorkovsky, he definitely knew.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
That was
so I think it's a much more complicated dynamic, even though, of course, Putin knew or gave. The green light is seen at the top, but a lot of other people who I don't think are as controllable always as it might seem down the chain act on their own. Some other places, not just Moscow. So I'm always recalled about the kid, before Maria was born, and Walt Disney had this table full of mouse traps with ping pong balls on them, and then one ping pong ball which set the trap off set loose a lot of other ping pong balls in the system, which then all went boom, 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 boom. And it's a complicated process. So while I don't disagree with you, I think bureaucratically a lot is going on here.
I mean, I'm not convinced that Putin ordered this.
No,
case.
exactly.
But I would think that it would be something he would, he may have sent a signal out to say, we need to make an example of some youth activist somewhere in the country, preferably in the provinces where there'll be not a lot of.
Rid me of this priest. But remember when we talked about Nemtsov's killing, Brian, here.
Being at the 5-year anniversary, by the way, which is 1 week from today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, Ryan, they tell him post facto. I think there's a lot of kind of bureaucratic dynamics going on. He says whatever he might do.
Yeah.
So this, I think, is going on, too.
Two things, right? We know that the Kremlin identifies internet and internet freedom as a threat. It's literally written down in the Kremlin's information security doctrine. Second, we know that the protesters and the youth among them are noticed. Again, there's multiple projects that the Kremlin has been investing in since 2017 that's designed to reincorporate the youth into some kind of the Kremlin cover. Rosmolodezh, the Russian youth projects have been have received a lot of funding, and that's etc. We know those are identified as threats, and we know that the Kremlin is working in that direction. For example, the internet is increasingly "quote unquote" managed. That is, there's more censorship. They just passed another request for all the smartphones sold in Russia to install certain applications, etc. So why not to assume that the same takes place when it comes to the youth, especially that it's not the first trial. What is absolutely stunning is the sentencing weaknesses and tortures in this case, but we also have the new greatness.
Although torture is nothing new in Russian police methods.
Not new, but at this scale, consistent, despite the fact that this trial has received, as we have discussed, and public attention, they still continued with really horrible methods, tortures applied to these poor kids. And of course, as I said, not just Сеть, but also New Greatness Новое Величие, also the Moscow trial. So they're quite aware, thinking that...
They being the Kremlin.
I mean, in the Kremlin, So I wouldn't think that Putin lives in ivory tower. I think they understand the threats, and they're trying to, again, quote unquote, manage those threats.
Yeah,
but I agree. But all I'm saying is that when this they may have what they perceive to be a green light. Putin says, all right, and the details, torture could happen in sort of a semi-controllable way. Some lower-level guy, we've seen this dynamic again and again and again, and we've all talked about it. So I'm not disagreeing, just adding some kind of a bureaucratic
nuance,
overlay, confusion to it. The torture, though, seems new, and seems new recently, Brian. I don't know. It's hard.
I mean,
or did torture exist?
I remember a human rights report on police torture that came out in the 90s during the Yeltsin time when you and I were both in Moscow.
In the stage of the regime.
I still have it, actually.
This stage of the regime. But it does seem we're going in a lot of dimensions to something newer.
For me, what's new here is that this was fabricated out of whole cloth. And this is where it looks Stalinist, where in the Stalin time, things were fabricated out of whole cloth. And that's what seems to happen here. And this, in the past, in every other politicized case, they were fabricated, but there was something that to build a fabrication upon, right? Navalny did participate in the Kirovsky, helping the Kirov Oblast, buy lumber, and which led to the Kirov-Les case. But he did nothing illegal when he did it. But they fabricated a fake case. Here, there appears to be nothing. They just invented it. Now, the other thing that comes to mind here immediately, in terms of comparison and perhaps contrast, is the case of Ivan Golunov, the journalist who had narcotics planted on him. Now that he was eventually freed, and now those police are being prosecuted themselves. Now, Maria, what do you see here? I mean, you see two different, because I think the Golunov case was part of the same type of case designed to intimidate troublesome journalists in this case, but they backed off there after public protest.
So Golunov, I think, is a little bit different, although it is similar in the sense that, again, we see the society is awakening, right? That arrest has created a massive public activism again across all of Moscow, which eventually contributed to the fact that he was eventually released. But fabrication, for example, he didn't have any drugs, right? They were implanted by the police officers, right? So in this sense, fabrication, again, purely from scratch.
Well, this is again why this case, I saw this as kind of a parallel case,
but not necessarily
but
that
not
new.
how it was dispatched, because he was freed, he was exonerated.
But why, right? Why? Typically, in the majority of the cases, when it comes to drugs, and those drugs are again introduced by the police officers themselves, most of the times the people are not released. It's a huge way for Russian police officers to get bribes. And also there is a very interesting statistic. So you need to possess a certain amount of grams of drugs for you to be sentenced in a very dramatic, harsh way. And interesting enough, guess what? The majority of the arrests happen of the people who get discovered with drugs. They all have just a little bit above that particular threshold of drugs that's necessary for those sentences to be put on them. So which suggests that all of them are fabricated. Also, in case of Golunov, it's important to remember that his protectors, like the editor-in-chief of Meduza, Alexei Venediktov, Yelizaveta.
He had powerful protectors in the media.
Yeah, they had at the top. They had powerful protectors. He had himself powerful protectors in the media, who then contacted members of presidential administration, which subsequently quite accelerated the case.
But if this were a politically important case, that would not have mattered. That would not have mattered.
Not to such an extent. I think it would have played a role, but not to such an extent. Golunov, he always was made sure to distance himself from politics. He's a great journalist. He did some good investigations for Medusa, but he always was very made sure to distance himself from politics, partly because it's how he gets his contacts. You need to be able to talk to those people. And that was the case afterwards. Many people were quite upset with his reactions and how he essentially addressed all these protesters after he was released, because he didn't really give him the much credit. At least some people thought this way. So this is a little bit different because of the so-called quote-unquote elite case of Golunov, so to speak. Several factors combined that really protected him. Yeah.
And then not only did they release him, the police officers that framed him are now being prosecuted.
Yeah, that is another.
Now, is that a bone to civil society? What is that?
Definitely to both the civil society and also the powerful actors at the top that served as protectors of Golunov. Through Margarita Simonyan, by the way, the RT editor-in-chief, among others. So, and also even this, by the way, took quite some effort and pressure on Golunov part and his.
So you don't see the Set case going in the same
Unfortunately,
direction.
the poor kids in Penza are absolutely vulnerable and defenseless in this
even
case.
As high profile as this has become kind of a nationally known
helps,
case.
And it's very important that it continues and that it takes countrywide scale. Definitely that will give a chance to reduce the sentences, because we've observed that before. But there's several factors that play against these guys. And also the fact that the Kremlin is paranoid about something that's terrorist allegedly, and also allegedly threatening the Kremlin's existence, and the kind of frames that this trial has received and the accusations that these kids have received, they make it unlikely that they're going to be relieved easily, unfortunately.
Don, anything?
Yeah, I just want to go back to the issue of the view from the top, which is to say there's a number of key questions here which we have struggled with in this program and aren't sure about. Do they see the society changing and possibly a way hostile to the regime? Yes, of course. Is there a debate about what kind of repression to use? Yes, I think so. And I don't think everybody, and probably Putin wants massive repression. And so these kinds of things, it's almost, I think, testing the waters, moving in one direction, seeing the reaction, backing off. And so I think they're very nervous. We see that, guys, across the board. And I think most people, although some are prepared to really crack down, I think most people want it selective and limited and see how that works. Will it work? Maria, you're the public opinion expert. I'm not sure that it will.
I'm wondering, I mean, there is a range of places this could go. This could end up like the Golunov case. I think it's unlikely, but the message would be sent even if these people were released. That
torture.
Torture. That's going to scare young people. Yeah. It's going to scare anybody. It's going to scare old people too.
Yeah.
But it can also go in a completely different direction. The other metaphor I had thought about with this is the Leningradskaya deal. If you want to go back to the Stalin, no, this case, supposedly, they were part of this massive international terrorist organization that had branches in like Belarus and several Russian cities. So this was only a small part of this group. And if the other thing that sprang to mind, if they want to go to plan maximum with this, Delosati can be the Leningradskaya Dela of our time. Maria, what do you think? Am I off my rocker here? Am I getting old and senile?
I think nothing is true and everything is possible. I think Peter Pomerantsev nailed it. So nothing at this point is absolutely impossible. I think right now they're going to try to stick with this case and see how the society responds. We are at a very important moment right now. Will this public, wave of collective petitions, protests, create some kind of strong enough pressure on the Kremlin to be able to scale it down? In that case, they are not likely to go further with this. This is where we definitely see parallels with Golunov, which was one of the first cases we saw, which demonstrated that the public is awakening again. So they're trying to stop this. Unfortunately, there's two very opposite forces within the Russian society. One is repressions, the other one this awakening civic activism. And we are witnessing they start clashing, and this is interesting to watch and unfortunate to live through.
Well, let's spin this out a little bit then. let's spin this out and let's say they decide to go for this maximalist approach to this. And let's say the Dila Sati does become the 21st century version of Leningradskoye Dila. Now, I don't expect people to be shot in the basement of Lubyanka yet, but you could see more young people being arrested in more cities tied to this evil Sati, Set group. And you'll see programs on Pirvi Canal talking about all the things they're allegedly doing. They will create this entire fiction. I mean, you could see this happening.
Blaming the U.S. and Ukraine
I can
and
see this happen. The U.S. and Ukraine are involved in this, and it's a CIA plot hatched in the basement of Langley. And before we know it, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people tied up in this thing. How does society react?
Yeah. We both look at Maria and say, how will society react?
How does society react then? Because I'm spinning out, I'm not saying this is the likely scenario, but it's also a possibility that I don't rule out. How do you see society reacting to
It's
that?
a huge pressure on me, honestly, to respond for all of Russian society. We see it's changing. That's my key point. The scale of the change is not obvious yet, at least not to me. We, for example, expected that the younger Russians, the students, when they come back from this summer vacations last fall, they will join in this wave of protests created by the Moscow trials in August 2019, and it will take a larger scale in Moscow, which is generally more protest prone. Unfortunately, we didn't see that, and I, for example, do not quite understand why. I tried to ask them, but they can't really, like my friends, the younger students there, they can't really give a good answer to that. It wasn't of their interest all of a sudden, even if it was just a couple of months ago. So this is hard to say. However, it's still understood in Russia that there's certain kind of, I think, pride to it. There is certain element of identity where we cannot allow those kind of monsters methods be applied in contemporary Russian societies, right? We travel to the West, we wear the same clothes, we talk to our peers who are just like we are, and we're more or less speaking the same language. This comparative framework, and by the way, I just finished a survey of the Russian youth that actually shows the same thing. Russians who are even younger Russians, 16 to 34, who are more open to the West, who speak different languages and in general open to the world, they are much more civically active. That's because there's a certain element of identity here. We can't allow this to happen to us. So I at least hope that kind of horrendous, horrible scale of mass repressions would create some backlash, because there's certain thresholds that we cannot allow, and this I think we see through this increasing number of petitions that people send. We can't allow this to happen to us anymore. We are not there.
But how can they push back?
These protests, the Kremlin is afraid of protests. We know that for a fact. Petitions, all kind of civic activism, Golunov case or the Moscow trial cases have demonstrated that it works. It worked repeatedly in the past. The problem is how large the scale of this resistance is going to be. And of course, on the economic side, just a quick point from comparative politics, is that massive repressions are quite costly. It's not easy for the Kremlin itself really to implement that. You need the apparatus, the security apparatus, you need jails. Even during the Moscow trials, remember, they ran out of space, empty spaces in jail. They couldn't arrest any more people. They arrested like 3,000 people, but then they had to release a lot of them just because they didn't have any space to keep them in. So luckily for Russians, there is just objective limitations to how huge those repressions can be.
I mean, we could, if this spins out that way, begin to see a decisive showdown between the old and the new Russia, effectively, with this. I mean, I'm not sure, and I'm not even sure if I think it's going to go in that direction, but if you look at this case, it has all the hallmarks of some grand conspiracy case that's going to involve more than this first group. And we'll see people, if this supposedly big terrorist organization was formed, there's got to be terrorists all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And, sooner or later, we're going to find out it was financed by the Americans or NATO or something. But
no doubt about that, yeah.
Done.
Yeah, at this point, it might be appropriate, as I said earlier, Brian, to you off mic, that there's a very interesting article in The Bell this week arguing that there are 2.6 million siloviki in Russia, and we can define that in a number of ways. And
it was project investigation, just small correction. Investigation by project.
Yes, project. And extremely, we're talking about the society changing, but I think one way the society is changing is this group is steadily...
How do they define siloviki?
Well, they talk, probably not in ways the three of us would, but they talk about the MVD, the National Guard, and so forth.
Okay.
2.6 million people work for the, quote, power departments. You can define it in any way.
FSB, GRU,
exactly.
Interior,
I think what you're seeing, though, I think what you're seeing compared to, say, 10 years ago is this element of society, which is still relatively small, but not by Western standards, moving much more to the center of Vlast. And this causes, perhaps as a factor contributing to the reaction we've seen, you have to be very careful how you define siloviki. Brian, you're right.
Yeah.
But I think we talk about the different trends in society. One's toward more monopolization in the economy, which is going on for a long time. This, I think, is also very interesting. It talks about a regime that, even by the feeble standards of Putinism, is not as open as it was before. But there's tension there, and Maria, you accurately describe it. There's tension there. Brian, I don't know where they're going to go with this.
Well, the other thing that I'm thinking about with this, and this is actually one of the reasons I included this, I wanted to talk about this week, because I think this is potentially relevant to the 2024 question, to the whole question of succession and Putin constructing a system that keeps him in power forever. You're going to need some dramaturgy.
Yeah.
You're going to need some dramaturgy. And the conventional wisdom has always been it was going to be a foreign adventure. It was going to be a annexation of Belarus or a new offensive in Ukraine, which, by the way, we just saw a new offensive in Ukraine this week. So much for Dima Kozak coming in and, like, them taking a softer line.
Exactly.
So much for that. But there's also a chance you could do the dramaturgy domestically.
Yeah.
And there are domestic enemies. This is as old a Russian method as the foreign enemies bit. And it's best when the domestic and the foreign enemies are connected to each other.
Yes.
So this has all of the hallmarks of the kind of dramaturgy they're going to need to basically create this new system that turns Putin into, like, the dear leader forever.
Brian, they seem to be building a potential way to move in a number of directions.
Yes, they are.
To be determined, which you argued repeatedly on this program in the last couple. This is one snapshot of a system that's changing. They're keeping their options open. Putin is keeping his options open. So you see a lot of balls sometimes apparently going in different directions. But who's to say?
Just a small point along with Brian, your argument. A couple of years ago, Russia's first TV channel broadcasted a show among sleepers, the so-called sleeping agents within the Russian society that's implanted by CIA early on, and they sleep until something important happens when they have to be activated. And guess what?
If we were only that good.
That's a good point. Dear KGB, please don't listen to us right now. But it's interesting. Guess what? Where those sleepers are found primarily among Russia's opposition leaders, among Russian civic activists, of course. So I mean, they're definitely working on it.
Mostly in Moscow, right?
Mostly in Moscow. Yeah.
They sleep a lot there.
There's a funny irony in all this. There's this group called Syet. There was a pro-Kremlin group, if I remember correctly, I don't know if it ever got off the ground, but it was one of Surkov's many projects called Syet. It was like, years and years ago, and it never really went anywhere, but I distinctively remember that. Well, on this note, we'll segue to the second half. In a few moments, we'll continue our discussion and check in on those constitutional changes designed to keep Putin in power for life. I'd like to remind you are listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA, and joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also with us in the studio is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. So that proposed amendment to change the title of the Russian president to quote unquote supreme leader failed to pass committee. So there's that.
There's that. There's more, though.
But there's more. Another amendment giving former Russian presidents immunity from prosecution for life did in fact pass. Now, as I said on the Vertical video this week, there are exactly two reasons why an ex-president would need immunity. One, an expectation that they will be corrupt. Or two, an expectation that prosecutions will be political. Right? If presidents are expected to be corrupt, well, damn, you got to give them immunity or else everybody's going to get prosecuted. And if prosecutions are going to be political, even honest presidents are going to have something to worry about. Well, guess what? Both of these conditions are present in Russia. Yeah. Presidents are expected to be corrupt, and so it seems pretty logical. This is the one big thing that jumped out at me this week. Other things that have jumped out, Maria, that we've talked about off mic, are that the presidency seems to be being strengthened as Putin is laying the groundwork to leave the presidency, because the two-term limit is now pretty hard and firm, but yet the presidency is being strengthened. And this was pointed out by Boris Pastukhov at Oxford University on St. Anthony's College, Oxford, that this paradox of what Putin's doing here. And in a piece this week, he argued he's doing the Boris Godunov, problem where he's basically going to say, leave without leaving. What do you see as this process moves forward? What are your thoughts on this?
So just a reminder to our audience that we have discussed several possible transition scenarios, right? That the Belarus scenario, creation of a new union state, the state council / security council scenario where Putin would head something non-electable structure by resigning from the position of the presidency. And then, of course, there is the last one where Putin just nullifies, abolishes his previous terms and again gets reelected as a president. So the current institutional design, the constitutional design, the way is laid out based on the existing amendments. Again, we don't know the final outline yet because the second reading has not yet
these things are still place. In committee in the Duma in the second reading.
So it's still in flux. Creates several impressions. First of all, it seems that they are not quite sure themselves what they're doing. It seems that they
Kirill Rogov had a piece about a hilarious post on Facebook, Maria, that you highlighted, where it was just going through with all those does everybody understand everything? Yeah. I think the last line was no vot tak. There you go. Because it was completely confusing what was in. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Because there's so many of these amendments that they keep multiplying. New ones offered. Some of them are definitely approved by the presidential administrations. Others we're not quite sure because, quite frankly, very stupid. So what the heck is going on? It seems that they might have had an original plan, but something has happened that is changing it a little bit.
Right.
Second of all, at least as of now, looking at the current outline of the amendments, the state council option does not look very plausible because it would imply that if you remember, Putin is the final arbiter sitting in this security council or state council, but other authority is redistributed across different institutions underneath him that are acting as checks against each other. So the Belarus option would require a completely different outline of the state, so that we're not looking at right now. In the current institutional design, as it looks at based on current amendments, the president is reinforced in that he actually becomes the head of the executive branch. The prime minister, who is currently the head of the executive branch in Russia, de facto becomes a puppet. I mean, we know as a matter of fact.
As opposed to now.
As opposed to, that's exactly why those changes are so ridiculous. They're not adding anything new to the reality.
You know what I think, actually, and after reading Kirill Rogov's piece and we've been talking about this, I think this is all just a bunch of pakazuka, and they're basically creating they know what they want to do, or they know that they want to set certain options for themselves institutionally when it comes time to make the decision. So I still think the three
preserve the essence of the Putin system.
The three councils, state, security, and federation.
Yeah.
are going to be, the Politburo, the Central Committee, and the Secretariat, or the Supreme of the new configuration. That I think is, and everything else right now is noise and smoke.
It's
and
very
mirrors.
likely, but the question
they're
is,
making the illusion that they're reasonable. Like, oh no, we're not going to make the Supreme Leader. That's just silly. Who would ever think of such a thing, right? That was all I thought dramaturgy.
Last time we discussed a little bit, but everything that Kremlin does is a special operation. So you need to create a lot of noise and uncertainty. Uncertainty is key, so you are sudden and unpredictable. No always know what the heck you're doing. And I think right now, looking at these amendments, it actually pretty much achieved. We have no clue
Remember,
why
nothing's passed yet.
And nothing's passed yet. That's why I amended the second reading.
The first reading passed. We're in the second reading, which is the crucial reading in any piece of Russian legislation. That's when amendments are voted on. Amendments are currently being voted on in committee. And then it's you get the final markup, and it goes to third reading, which is pretty much pro forma. So we won't see the real contours of this until the full Duma votes on which amendments to pass in second reading. We're in the committee phase of second reading right now. I mean, it's kind of weird to be actually focusing on these institutional aspects of Russian politics when institutions don't generally don't mean jack.
That's why there's everything that we're discussing really meaningless.
And remember, this came out of some committee or some person's brain.
It's in the brain. It's in the State Building and Legislation Committee of the State Duma right now.
One question, though. Under the State Council, Security Council design that we discussed, and we tend to prioritize, all of us, I think, the presidential authority shouldn't be reinforced. Ideally, it should be weakened.
That is the fly in the ointment right now. That is the thing that I can't get my head around.
Exactly.
Why are they? And the only thing I can think of is that Putin is trying to keep the options open, including the presidency as his final seat. And if he can, but still, if he's going to leave the presidency, he's not going to want a strong presidency, I don't think.
We don't really have a clear heir apparent. Would you take Dima off the table? And most people would want to take him.
I don't know.
No, I don't think we should take him off the table.
I don't think you ever take Medvedev off the table. This is Putin's little puppy. He's going to go wherever Putin goes.
Again,
and you don't often find people like that. In that sense, Medvedev is very valuable.
It's not easy to find good puppies.
So Medvedev is really valuable to Putin.
And that's why I said initially, the day, and if you remember the piece Maria, you and I both wrote on the day this happened, and I said, this is not a demotion for Medvedev. On the contrary, I'm watching where Medvedev lands. And to say institution is important.
I would caution, and Maria and I have had this discussion, we would caution the extent to which we take separation of powers or constitutionalism. Not for you, but for and people we talk to, that don't take it too seriously, because this is about power and money and preserving.
This is one of those rare instances where you do have to pay attention to the institutional aspects of law of legislation being passed, not because that process is valid, but that it is giving us signals about what has already been decided
about
by
dynamics. Exactly, absolutely.
And also, there's a lot of hype that Putin himself created around that. He tries to portray this as some kind of his legacy.
Yeah,
that's why it's not very clear, if he was to return as a president again, how he's planning to go back from where he is right now, right? He's trying to portray this as, I'm giving this to you, the Russian people, as his legacy, and here's the whole bunch of populist measures associated to this. It's like a gift for you to come along, because all of this is so special and unique. So there's alternative option that came out, is that he's currently going to reinforce the presidency for this interim period, and then he's going to weaken it again. But that again does not sound likely, given how much hype has been built around this constitutional amendments. Again, doesn't mean this is going to stop them in the future. It's just not very logical.
When we see how the final shape of this, and they could always walk back the strengthening of, and how specifically are we seeing the presidency strengthened, really?
Yeah, this is what I want to point out.
Can you dive into that a little bit?
First of all, in the past, the prime minister would come with his own cabinet, and if the prime minister is dismissed, the cabinet goes as well. Right now, the president will be able to dismiss the prime minister without dismissing the rest of the cabinet. In this sense, the responsibility is on the president now, and the prime minister is really not very important. Second of all, of course, the president is now getting the ability to appoint security apparatus ministers, which was not the case the all security apparatus, ministers and heads of the security of the Silovikis are going to be now appointed by the president. Again,
I thought that was always the case.
I don't think that. I think they say it's actually
interesting. I always thought
currently.
that was always the case.
Currently, the president is not the head of the executive branch. The head of the executive branch under Russia's constitution is prime minister.
Now, why does that matter?
Again, that's a different question. That's not the question. It's not the question I'm answering right now. And ultimately, one of the key developments is, of course, the president's ability to dismiss the constitutional court's judges. That's
that's an additional power. Although, let's face it, de facto, Putin had that power in reality. If he could,
can I put a little bit more pressure on Maria for a second here?
Of course.
I'm saying that
Always.
in a humorous way. To tie both parts of this discussion together, which has been very interesting to me, to what extent does Vlast manipulate constantly or stumble or whatever we interpret is going on at the top without the society reacting in some way? Does this, I would think, given the social changes we've seen and talked about many times on the program, that this is not going to be ultimately as easy as it might seem. I don't know, but they're not operating in a vacuum, certainly the kind of vacuum they operated 10 years ago. So I just raise it to say there might be a reaction of some sort, not necessarily protests in the street, but a galvanization of other points of view that doesn't like to be manipulated as appears to be going on here.
One important point, I think the Kremlin agrees, because instead of doing a referendum that would supposed to approve, by the way, each amendment separately by the Constitution, instead of the whole bunch of them in one package with also a bunch of populist promises, the Kremlin is not even doing that, despite all this populist honey that comes along. But the Kremlin is instead does this general voting that's probably going to come after Putin has even signed it. So that loses absolutely any significance.
Right.
The plebiscite, I think it's called.
Is it binding?
No, that's the point. And the key difference between the referendum and plebiscite is that plebiscite is not binding. People are just going to show up, vote, and are going to provide some kind of legitimacy to this whole bunch of changes, which are, again, none of that is constitutional. But the point that Don raised is important. I think the Kremlin is that uncertain about how people are going to react that it's not even given the people the right to really vote for those changes, despite all those populist promises that come along.
I think that's probably accurate. I would also add that these changes to presidential powers appear to be largely cosmetic. And again, this is a lot of noise. They're creating the impression, and it's becoming conventional wisdom, that the presidency was being strengthened. Because I asked, what are these powers actually? The ones you delineated, I had heard. I was wondering if I was missing something, because they all of those look kind of cosmetic to me. And if you create the public impression that, we still have a strong presidency, where in reality you make sure the three councils, state, federation, and security, are where power really lies, and if Putin's the head of each one of those.
But by the way, the president also forms the state council, right? That's also interesting. So the president is ultimately the one who's going to form these alleged institutions that Putin is supposed to head.
He's going to be able to name more members to the Federation Council than the president currently can name. That I know.
That's also true, But he's also formed State Council.
And the Security Council, he fully forms the State Council, or does it get nominated by regional leaders? And I mean, I have to look at the minutia on this. Because when we finally see what they finally are going to be voting on in the Duma, I can see that we'll be able to see where Putin's intentions are. And if you see him walk back the presidential powers, or if they remain just these cosmetic things that they appear to be right now, then you could just give the presidency to Dima and everything will be cool, right? But I mean, it's still it's an interesting process. It's really? For old school Kremlinologists like us, Don, this is kind of fun. It's almost like going back in time, where you have to kind of parse through all these institutional things that don't mean anything.
I'd rather watch where they stand on what?
On the mausoleum.
Not for this program, Brian, but maybe for a future program. I find, and I think the same way, this comparison to the Secretariat, so the Politburo and the Central Committee. Very interesting.
I'm going to write this up once we
You
see
should,
a final.
yeah.
Once we see the final.
Yeah,
I'm waiting
Brian,
for
because
the
you
Duma
have a
to-
generation here, and we talk about political culture all the time, that really is not really, many of them don't have, younger people,
Right.
don't have much of a memory
of the Soviet
of that.
system.
So this way of organizing power institutionally persists. I'm looking forward to your article.
I'm waiting
Because
until I see the
yeah,
final
yeah,
thing the
yeah,
Duma's going to
yeah.
vote on.
There are other
and what it
examples in the
looks
system
'cause then
like
I think
this,
I'll be
but
able to.
this is relevant
Because
for this
the
discussion.
president, I think, is going to end up being like the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, which is basically the president of the USSR, right? But it didn't mean anything. Can you name one?
Nikolai Podgorny.
The Podgorny,
good
yes, that is correct.
But my
Gold-
question, Brian, is really why does this kind of institution creating persist?
Right.
Why is it there? And people like Maria have no memory of the Supreme Soviet. You and I barely do, but it persists. It's a very interesting question.
The person we considered the leader of the Soviet Union often didn't even really have a state post.
Exactly.
It was a party post.
Yeah.
Secretary General of the Communist Party of the USSR was not a state post; it was a party post.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's different. I mean, I'm very curious to see what the final
waiting for your article.
text of this looks like. But I would argue that we should also do a program. On that.
Remember, Suslov was more powerful than a lot of the former political leaders.
He was, and he was the Surkov of his time. He was Suslov was the ideologist. He was the Surkov of his time. Go ahead, Maria.
For one question, one answer about these institutional continuities, one answer is that the only thing Putin knows. So for him, it's natural to go back. Second of all, for the sake of criminologists out here, I just have to mention that rumors are spreading in nearby by the Kremlin that preliminary elections are going to take place in Russia.
Yes, no, that's a good point to bring up. Yeah,
especially for the parliament, we are not quite sure why. Maybe it's because the support for Putin is declining.
Or maybe it's these terrorist groups that are going to
spreading around.
Preempt what they see as rising opposition. Who knows? But
that's
important to keep in mind. So there's something going on.
Presidential elections
and
also
presidential
might be pushed
elections
up.
as well. So something's going on again that hasn't yet shaped completely. So it's very hard to get a whole picture of it. But certainly going to make for interesting conversations.
I mean, this is the old bulldogs under the carpet kind of situation. But what we can see from the carpet is like how the text of these amendments ends up looking, because you can kind of see what's been decided inside the inner circle. There's, as we talked about last week, factional fights over this between different elements of the elite. So this will keep us busy. Second reading is scheduled for when? The vote on the second reading is sometime in March, right?
Sometime in March 20th. But I'm afraid
end of March, right? So and then once you have that second reading passed, third reading is an up or down vote on what they got. So that's a pro forma vote. So when we see the final text that passes the second reading and we see what the institutional arrangements look like, then we'll have a much better idea. We got another month to wait. That should keep us all highly, it'll be March Madness, Russian style. So well, on that note, unless you guys
just
want
one more thing,
one more anything
point,
you want to add,
I heard about Podgorny from my grandmother, who read a book about it.
I mean, wasn't Kalinin the head of state formally during World War II?
I don't know. I wasn't born yet.
Anyway, on that note, I guess we'll wrap it up. Good discussion. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia program here at SIPA, and join me here in the studio has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us in the studio has been Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University who will get a haircut tomorrow. I got one today, just in case anybody was wondering. Thank you both for an enlightening and interesting discussion. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our producer, Mikhail Harmata, for keeping all the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.